Thank you very much, Luigi and Paul, for the invitation and for organizing the workshop. Yes, so today I'll be speaking on the sluicing-like construction in Igbo. So sluicing, as we know it, is a type of ellipsis that involve interrogative clauses such that the interrogative clause is reduced and we only have a WH. So the example in 1 is showing what is known as embedded sluicing. Bill bought something, but I don't know what. And in 1B, we have the case of matrix sluicing. Bill bought something, what? So I'll be looking at these two kinds of sluicing in Igbo. When we look at sluicing in 1, for English, a prominent account of this is that it involves WH movement followed by TP deletion. So the analysis is as in 2, we have a full CP, the WH phrase is moved to the specifier of CP, and then the TP is being deleted. So for this talk, I'm using the more descriptive term that's used by Paul and Postam, which is the sluicing-like construction, in the sense that in some other languages, as I also show for Igbo, the kind of syntactic operation is not that of WH movement, but can involve some other kind of syntactic operation. And then there are also languages where what is left in the sluice site is not just a WH phrase, as in what that we saw in English, but we still have some other elements. So for instance, in Chinese, in addition to the WH phrase, we get the copula she, and a common analysis for that by Adams and Tomioka is that they have a copula clause in the sluice site. So they assume that there is a node pronominal subject in the copula clause, then followed by this copula and the WH question. So a common analysis that we also find in some other language where we have other elements apart from the WH phrase left, as in the Japanese example we have in 4, is that of a reduced cleft analysis. So the proposal is that we have a full cleft in the sluice site, and then the cleft clause in this cleft construction, that's the relative clause there, is deleted, and then we have the remaining elements, which are the WH phrase, followed by the copula, and this question particle car in the language. So when we come to African languages, it seems to be the case that not so much have been done when it comes to sluicing construction or sluicing-like construction, but the few works that we have shown some very interesting discovery. So for instance, in Gungbe, Liptak and Abo showed that we have the rare case of sluicing inside relative clauses. So sluicing is not just to be restricted to WH questions. And then for languages that also have focus movements with special kind of focus marking, just as Luigi just showed us, especially the Niger-Congo languages, we've also shown that these languages kind of provide counterexamples to the merchant's popular sluicing comp generalization. That's the cross-linguistic generalization that in sluicing construction, it seems to be the case that the C elements that we normally get in non-elliptical constructions do not appear in sluicing cases. So for instance, we have data from Gungbe, from Turkey by Bila and Basong, and also a recent work on Nupe showing that the sluicing comp generalization doesn't seem to hold. So the example we have in 5 and 6 is that of Mendes and Kadimbovis on Nupe. So 5, the example of 5 is showing non-elliptical construction where in Nupe, you always have this clause final O, which they analyze to be the focus marker in the language. And then in the example in 6, where we have the sluicing-like construction, so they assume that the sluice has identical structure as the non-sluice site. But what we see is that what you have left in the sluice is not just the WHK, but rather you also must have the focus marker as well. So for the Nupe data, they assume the split CP hypothesis, and they argue that what you have is some kind of ellipsis of the fin P. So the argument is that the DP is focus moved to the specifier of focus in the clause, and then you have the the fin P being deleted. So by deleting this, the fin P, you delete alongside every other thing contained within this projection. So now back to Igbo. So as I showed you earlier, in English, we have this embedded sluicing as well as a matrix sluicing. So but looking at the English data, it seems to be the case that there's really no real evidence to show that we have differences between those two. But for Igbo, I'm going to show that we see this clear difference between matrix sluicing and embedded sluicing. And this is not just something random, but I'll point out that it seems to follow from the fact of what we have in non-elliptical cases in this language. So in non-elliptical, embedded, and matrix question, these are all different, and they seem to reflect or mirror what we see in the case of the sluicing-like construction. So the two types of sluicing are exemplified in 9 and 9A and B. So 9A is showing that of matrix embedded sluicing, where we have Obi Manamami Yobu. Literally, it means Obi bought something, but I don't know thing it was. And in the case of matrix sluicing, Obi bought something, you can just have the WH phrase, what. Yeah. So for the talk, I will start by looking briefly general background on Igbo, what we consider the non-ellipsis cases of WH questions, as well as cleft constructions in the language. Then I'll move on to look at the basic properties of matrix sluicing and embedded sluicing. And the proposal I'm going to be making here today is that both kinds of sluicing, that they originate from copular clauses. And then I will consider an alternative analysis to look at that of deriving this from cleft construction. And I'm going to point out that this will probably not be the best way to go. And finally, I'll draw the conclusion. So a brief background on Igbo. It's a Benue-Congo language it's a tone language with 3 tones, high, low, and downstep. And tone has been shown to play a lot of lexical and grammatical function in the language. So verbs can bear affixes to express tense, aspect, mood, and the rest. And there is a lack of case and agreement morphology in the language. And in terms of the basic order data, it is an SVO language. And in previous work with Doreen, I've shown that heads precede complements, and we have this obligatory EPP on T. So now I'm looking at WH questions. Igbo has 3 strategies for forming constituent question. So the first one, what we see is what's involved focus movement. So where we have the WH phrase moving to the clause initial position. And whenever this happens, when we have this overt movement, we always get this car, which we analyze as focus marker. But I will show you later that in these cases, we only get it with non-local subjects and objects. So with local subjects, you never get the car element. And so apart from this WH question that involved focus, we also have some other kinds of WH question, as in the one exemplified in 11B and C. So these ones, I've argued that they involve relative clauses. So for those involving focus movements, the analysis I proposed in my dissertation is as in 12, where you have this overt movement of the WH element. And then in Igbo, I also postulated that the fin head is actually realized with a floating tone, which we always see on the subject in the specifier of TP. So, so here, the data here is showing the subject-non-subject asymmetry that we've shown in earlier work with Doreen. And the idea is that for local subjects, we do not get the car marking, but that's not the only evidence for the non-movement of this local subject. There are also some other morphophonological evidence to show that the subject did not move. But for every other argument, whether it is objects or adjuncts, as in the examples in B and C, we always have this, this car marking immediately after the WH phrase. Yes, So for the WH questions involving focus, it's also possible to express them with the help of a cleft. So that is what we see in 14. So you can have the pronominal subject followed by the copula, and then you have the rest of the clause, and then you see also the focus marking elements in the example as well. So 14a is showing that of question, and then 14b is the answer to the question. And also, it's also good to point out here that the same subject, non-subject asymmetry that we get for the non-cleft one, we still have them without of the cleft. We still get the subject, non-subject asymmetry. Yes. So now looking at embedded questions. So embedded questions, they are very, very different from what we see in matrix question. So the first thing we observe is that we do not get the WH phrases. So if you look at the example in 15C, you cannot have the words in the embedded context, whether you have focus there or not. But rather, these embedded questions, they are expressed via relativization. This has long already been established by Goldsmith. And what you see is that they look exactly like relative clauses. So the example in B is showing that of relative clause, even knows the child that Obi saw. And then for the embedded question, we also see something similar. So Ibe knows what Obi bought, where we have this indefinite words in the structure. Yes, so for the analysis of the relative clause that I assume that of head external analysis, where the relative clause is adjoined to the head noun, and we have also this thin head with overt floating tone, and then there's some kind of empty operator movement within the relative clause. And moving on to the structure of cleft constructions, I showed you earlier that the WH questions involving focus can also be expressed with a cleft. So we have that of cleft construction where we have kind of focus movement within it in 17a. But then there are also another cleft where we do not get the focus marking, for instance, but rather what we see is that it looks exactly like a relative clause. So the analysis postulated for that of the cleft with focus is we have this focus movement, just as I showed you earlier, overt movement of the focus SP to the specifier of focus, and then we have car realizing the focus head. And for that involving relative clause, it's also the same thing as the relative clause I showed you earlier. So we have this head noun being base generated, and then we have the relative clause adjoined to it. Yes. So now, looking at the Sluicing-like construction in Igbo, the basic data I showed you earlier is that we see this clear distinction between matrix and embedded Sluicing-like construction. So the example here in 20 is to further show that it's not the case that we can actually substitute the word, for instance, in the case of the embedded context where I showed you earlier that we cannot get the WH phrase, but rather we have this indefinite element followed by the third person pronoun and then the copula. So the claim I'm making here is that they involve different syntax, but even though they involve different syntax, I'm going to argue that they both stem from copular clauses in the language. Yes. So now let's look at matrix, the matrix cases. Yes, so for that, I'm going to argue that they involve focus functioning, and one evidence we see clearly for that is the presence of this WH phrase that we get there, and not in an indefinite as in the case of the embedded case. And then I'm going to argue for kind of movement plus deletion analysis. But in this case, it's going to be focus movement and not WH movement as in the case of in English that we get. But then this is not the first work. There has been work to show, past works to show that it's not only the interrogative C, as in the English type of ellipsis, that can license a deletion of whether it is a TP or a FIMP or whatever you have, but rather that you can also have focus doing the same licensing for deletion. So the copular clause, with the copular clause in the slew side, so this means that we do not get a full-fledged syntactic structure similar to what we have in the antecedent. So in the case of the English, for instance, when you say something like John bought something, but I don't know what, the analysis is that what you have there is that what John bought. So we have like a full-fledged analysis. But in this case, I'm arguing that what we have here is a copula. So copula in the sense that John bought something, but I don't know what it is or what it was. So the structure is as in 21b, and that's what I show here in 22 also. So we have this, the overt movement of the focus element to the specifier of focus, and then we have for P, but I'm going to show rather later why this is not so. And then the fin P is deleted. So everything within the fin P is, goes along under the ellipsis case. Yes. So with the focus, with the analysis, the copular clause analysis, this also suggests or predicts that we would not get the subject-non-subject asymmetry in this case. So recall that I told you earlier that with local subject, we do not get car marking alongside with other morphological evidence of movement. But assuming assuming the copular clause analysis means that we have similar structure for whether it's the subject in this case or it's the object. So if you look at the example in 24 where we have the correlate, that is someone is in the subject position, but then in the slews, what I'm proposing is that what we actually have is it is who, where the who is now moved to the specifier of focus, and then the rest of the clause is deleted. And in the case of 24b, where we have the case of the correlate in the object position, so the same idea is that for the copular clause, this what element is also the post-copular DP, which is moved to the specifier of the focus phrase, and the rest of the clause is deleted. So that's what is shown in 25. So, but one thing we notice is that the car element that I showed you earlier that we always get when it is non-local subject do not appear in our cases of sluicing. So the idea is, what I'm suggesting is that it goes along with the sluicing comp generalization that has been made that in sluicing, no non-operator material may appear in comp. So the C, the car element we have here, focus the marker, which is a C element, do not appear in English. So it seems to be the case that Igbo seems to obey the sluicing comp, unlike languages like Nupe and Tuki and Gungbe, which are shown to be counterexamples to these cases. So 26, 27 is just to give analysis, an example of what the sluicing comp cross-linguistic generalization look like. So in non-ellipsis cases, we can have elements like who or did. In the WH cases, like what did Bill buy or who will John visit, but in cases of sluicing, we do not get those elements. So now, the point here on this slide is, why is it that we are deleting the FINP or the TP or the cases, and not just deletion of the focus, the intermediate level FOCBA? Yeah, so the analysis in the literature, really, so there's no Igbo data here, comes from the argument. First one is from the licensing question that whenever an XP is to be deleted or deleted, there's always an head doing the licensing. So that's one argument for that. And the other argument there in the literature is that of syntactic visibility. So the point here is that usually for syntactic operations, usually heads or maximal projection, but not always the case of intermediate positions that participate in syntactic operation. And then in a more recent study by Landau on English, it showed evidence from some Scopa effect of T to C in English to show that really is the case that is a maximal projection TP in English that is deleted. Yes. So now moving on to embedded sluicing-like construction. So similar to cases of English, Igbo also requires some kind of pronounced antecedent, usually is the case. So you get a correlate like someone or something in the antecedent clause. And then I showed you earlier, we do not get the WH phrase, but rather we get an indefinite, something like thing or person or place and the rest. So the properties of this embedded sluicing-like construction, so the first one that we see easily is that in addition to this indefinite like thing or person or what, the obligatory presence of the third person pronoun as well as the copula is also something that we see clearly there. And here I'm basically showing that we get it for all other arguments, not just for subject and object, and that no matter the kind of predicate that is used, so whether it is a predicate like know or say or remember or to be clear with, it's always the same kind of structure that we get in these cases of embedded context. So this is very important because it has been shown for instance, in Gungbe, that in some predicates, they tend to go with sluicing inside relative clauses, while some tend to go with kind of focus elements. But in Igbo, it seems to be the case that these are similar, no matter the kind of predicate that is used. And another property that I'm showing here for the embedded sluicing-like construction is that they are not sensitive to islands. So the example we have here is for English, which has also been shown the cases of sluicing not to be sensitive to islands. So we have the kind of relative clause island. So in the ellipsis case, we can say they want to hire someone who speaks a Balkan language, but I don't know which. But then in a non-ellipsis context where we have this full clause, the sentence is ungrammatical. The same thing also with the left branch case. And the examples here is to show that we get island sensitivity cases in non-ellipsis construction in Igbo as well. So I'm showing this with island effect. Whenever we do WH movements with a full clause, they are bad. The same thing with complex NP islands. But in the cases of sluicing-like construction, the sentences are really well formed. So in case of adjunct island in 38A, we can have which I left before, we could something, but I don't know what. But then if we tend to have like a full clause in 38B, this is bad. So the same proposal for the case of matrix sluicing here, the presence of the third person pronoun as well as the copula already suggests that we are dealing with two things. It's either we have a cleft construction in this clause or we are dealing with a copular clause. So I'm going to go with the idea, point that these are copular clauses, and I'm going to argue that they are copular clauses, and what we see is that the post-copular element thing here is moved, and we have the rest of the clause in the sentence. So here is a structure. So we have this post-copular DP element, which is moved to the specifier of a CP in the embedded clause position. So going by the copular clause analysis, so how do we now establish this kind of identity with what we have in the antecedent clause? So I'm arguing with what has been mentioned there by merchants is that of semantic identity. So it's not a syntactic one. So it's not like we have a full-fledged syntax in the SLU site as we have in the antecedent. So evidence for this, the first one comes from cases of sprouting, where we do not really see an overt correlate in the antecedent clause. So if you look at 41, we have Obi came without any mentioning of the time, but then in the case of sprouting, we can actually have cases of, but I don't know when. And another evidence for the semantic identity also comes to the fact that there are also cases of sluicing where the sluice does not really have the same syntactic operation as what we have in the antecedent. So in 42, we have, is the teacher scolding someone, which is clearly a yes-no question, So we can see that in Igbo, that's reflected with the third person singular pronoun, but has the interrogative low tone occurring immediately after the initial element teacher that we have there. But if you look at the B response in 42B, we have a WH. Yes, but I don't know who. So this is to show that it's not always the case that we have a full-fledged syntactic structure. So to summarize at this point, I've shown you that we have this distinction between matrix and embedded sluicing-like constructions in Igbo. And I assume that for the cases of the matrix sluicing-like construction, it's involve movement, focus movement, followed by a deletion. But in the cases of embedded sluicing-like construction, we simply have movement without any form of deletion, since the rest of the copular clauses are still overt. Now, let's now look at the copular clauses. I told you that I'm suggesting that both cases, they originate from copular clauses. So for the matrix case, we have a WH element in the post-copular position, which I assume is focus moved in the sluice. And in the case of the embedded sluicing-like construction, we simply have an indefinite, which I assume is moved, and then we have the rest of the clause. So the question at this point is, are these two copular clauses the same? I'll be arguing that they are not the same. And if we start by looking at the popular classification of copular clauses out there, the assumption is that we have these three kinds of copular clauses. So the first one is predicational copular clause. And in predicational copular clauses, the idea is that the pre-copular element, noun phrase, is always referential, while the post-copular one is less referential. And for specificational copular clauses, the pre-copular element is less referential and the post-copular element is referential. And for the equative cases, both the pre-copular element and the post-copular DP, they are always referential. So I will show that for these cases in Igbo, the cases of the sluicing-like, the pre-copular elements in both kinds of copular clauses are referential. Yes, so the point I'm making here is that matrix sluicing-like construction, they are equative in the sense that both the pre-copular DP and the post-copular DP are referential, going by the classification I just showed you. And for the embedded cases, we have a predicational copular clause where the pre-copular element is referential and the post-copular one is less referential, usually kind of a property. Yeah, so in both cases, the pre-copular constituent is referential, and the evidence for referentiality, the first evidence is that the pronominal subject can be replaced by a full subject DP. So if we were to continue our matrix embedded cases, not just stopping at the WH words, but continuing having a continuation like what it is or what is a thing, so we can actually substitute the pronoun with the full DP, the thing. The same thing also with the cases of the embedded sluicing-like construction. And the second evidence is that of pronominalization of the subject with that, which has been argued to be a property anaphor. So for this, that will only be found in the cases of specificational copular clauses, where we have less referential DP in the initial, in the pre-copular position. But then this example starts to show you that in both cases of a matrix and embedded sluicing-like construction, having that's the pronominal anaphor, they are bad. Yes, so for the embedded cases, they tend to show that they are predicational by having a more referential DP in the post-copular position and having an indefinite in the post-copular position. So predicational source have also been argued to satisfy the semantic identity that I mentioned earlier under sluicing. So the advantage of the copular clause analysis is that it kind of gives a natural explanation, for instance, for the presence of the pronoun and the copula that we get in the cases of embedded questions, embedded sluicing-like construction. And also, it accounts also naturally for the absence of the island effect that we see, in the sense that we are moving out of copular clauses. So these are not full-fledged clauses. So definitely, there's no island violating construction in the sentence. Yes. Now, looking at an alternative analysis, where we can assume now, in the case of embedded sluicing, that what we actually have in the sluice is not a copular clause, but rather we have a full-fledged cleft construction. So that will be something along the line of 52. So we have the full cleft. So in this case, it's a cleft involving relative clause and not that of focus, since we do not get the focus marker, which is one overt difference that we get in the two cases. So we can have a full-fledged cleft, and what we see is that since the pronoun and the copula survives this cleft, so we can assume that probably it is the cleft clause that is the relative clause within the cleft that is deleted. So we can derive this by speculating that the pivot of that's the post-copular element, or the pivot in the cleft, moves out, and then V is also able to move as well in order to escape ellipsis, and before we have the final deletion of the relative clause. So these are kind of sketched here, where we have the full clause initially, the head noun, and then we have the adjunction of the relative clause. And in here we have like the head noun moving now to the clause initial position, and then we have also the V, also the copula moving out before the deletion of the VP. Yes. So although this can be an approach to consider, but there are two main evidence that shows that this cleft clause approach might not be the first. So the first one will have to do with the fact that we are moving out of a complex DP, and complex DP have been shown in Igbo to constitute an island. And the second one is the cases of the island effect that I showed you earlier. So having a copular clause, we are not being constrained by an island structure, but in the case of cleft construction, they constitute islands and have been shown in previous works. And here, the example in 52b is showing exactly the same. So moving something out of the cleft construction shows the island effect that we see. Yes, so to conclude, I've shown you the data from Igbo showing what I showed to be like the differences between matrix and embedded sluicing. And I've proposed an argument along the line that matrix sluicing involved focus movements of the WH phrase from a copular clause followed by the deletion of the FIMP. And the case of embedded sluicing-like construction, we simply have movement without any form of deletion. And a copular clause source is being advocated for, but in this case, I show that these two kinds of sluicing-like constructions, they stem from different copular clauses. And I've also looked at an alternative analysis of looking at that as being originating from cleft clause, and I've shown data to show that the cleft clause analysis might not be the best way to go. Thank you.